I started talking about guidance. And the first thing I said was we've got to commit ourselves to allowing God to truly guide us. Now, you see, one of the things that can happen is that we decide what we want to do and then decide that that is God's way for us. Or we decide what we want to do and then ask God to bless what we've already decided. And by giving God one choice, of course, then we can assure that he aligns with us. However, as you may have heard me say before, we kind of need to align ourselves with him rather than the other way round. God's guidance is often subtle. It can be very much a question of little nudges, or just manipulation of circumstances around us. Now you might say to me, how can God manipulate circumstances around us for us? Isn't that going to hurt and affect other people? Well, the answer of course is no, because God knows all about those other people as well, and everything is shaped and manipulated in that amazing way. Now, just think about how big God is, how big a God must be to be able to do that. We're not talking here about some little godlet that will just do it for you if you make the right sacrifice, or if you're particularly devoted to that godlet and everybody else can get stuffed. God is actually working for everybody all of the time. He wants to. And those people who particularly seek him, he will be particularly working in their lives. But not to the detriment of other people. He works for all. Now, the only way that that can interlock perfectly, according to God's knowledge of every single person in the entire world, all at the same time, is that God's deployment and manipulation of circumstances has to be completely extraordinary and interdimensional. He knows the consequence of every action for every person and how all of those actions will collide together at any individual moment in time. That's an awfully big God. And that's a God we can trust in to get things right. It's a God who will be working things out not just for our blessing and benefit, for the blessing and benefit of others. And let's face it, we're put on this earth to love our neighbour as ourselves, not just to love ourselves. So we should expect God to be doing that, and expect God to be giving us opportunities to help others as well as to help ourselves. Sometimes this can happen in the most extraordinary way. So when something extraordinary does happen, you can say, well, Lord, what are you trying to do through this? How are you trying to work out your will? What's this all about? Sometimes things can seem to be going badly, and you say to God, well, wait a minute, that's not supposed to happen, is it? I thought you were going to do this. God has a bigger plan. And so when we submit our ways to the Lord and say, no, I want your guidance first, we have to accept that we become part of that bigger plan. We're listening to God, not just ourselves. And God is listening to a lot more than just us. But his bigger plan is also the best plan. And best is going to be better than whatever our plots and plans and purposes are. We have to be careful then to look in to ourselves and say, what is my real agenda? What's my real agenda? What's that thing that is really, really, really in there driving me? What are those things that I really, really want? And I'm not always sure I want God to have any involvement with. What are those things that are really in there that I really don't want God to touch? The things that I've so decided on that God can only guide me one way. Because it's at that point we start to turn our back on God. It's at that point that we have a deaf ear to his guidance. And we, no matter what God thinks, we're going to do this. Let's just pray that we can identify those danger zones, those hidden agendas, those things in our lives that are just so much the things that we want, that God can only say one thing to us about them, which is the thing we want to hear. And once we start to identify and understand those things, it will help us with discernment in everything, to understand what's the thing that we want God to guide us to do, or we believe that God will guide us to do, rather than genuinely letting God be God. So, Lord Jesus Christ, grant us grace to identify inside of ourselves our true agenda, the things that we must have on our list in life. Whenever we come to any issue where we might want God's guidance, grant us grace to identify where we've already decided what we want that guidance to be. Where even if we're praying about it, there is only one answer that we really want God to give. Grant us grace to identify anywhere in our lives where we've decided what God's guidance is without actually asking God, but just deciding it's got to be that, because that's what we want it to be. And grant us grace to identify those areas in our lives where we really don't want to ask God at all, because we're afraid he will give us the answer we don't want us to hear. And grant us grace to lay all these things before the Lord, so that we can move from basic or better to best.